I'd just like to quickly introduce our impressive panel so we can get started. There's been a few, two last-minute changes. You should have a bio for Arlo Chase, who's replacing Miriam Zucker, who couldn't be here today. As well, Audrey Choi could not make it either. Lynne Sagalyn is the Earl Katzis and Benjamin Shore Professor of Real Estate and Director of the Paul Milstein Center at Columbia Business School. Her most recent book is Times Square Roulette, Remaking the City Icon, an analysis of the politics, policy, and economics of one of the city's largest and longest redevelopment initiatives. She is also the author of Cases in Real Estate Finance and Investment Strategy. Dan Nissenbaum is the Chief Operating Officer of the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs. Paul Freitag is the Managing Director at the Jonathan Rose Company, and Arlo Chase is the Senior Vice President for Policy Initiatives at the New York State Homes and Community Renewal. With that, I will turn our panel over to Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And I just want to add my word. Is this on? Okay. I usually can project loud enough anyway. I want to add my word of thanks to John for organizing this and spending as much time as he did, which was considerable, in bringing really top-notch people on topic to today's session. This is a big topic, and we purposely did not sort of just focus on affordable housing, because what we want to do is sort of engage the panelists and you in a discussion of the broader issues of community development and the role of the private sector in stimulating and investing in community development and affordable housing. We're going to start off with 5 minutes of so from each panelist, starting with Dan, then Arlo, and then Paul. And then we're going to run this sort of interactive questioning from me to the panelists, but leave 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps a little bit more, for Q&A from the audience. So you should jot down your questions as we go along. So with that, I'll turn to Dan.
Terrific. Thank you, and I hope you can hear me all right. It's interesting being here, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I am an alumni. I was here at the business school from 86 to 88. We didn't have buildings that looked like this, and we certainly didn't have conferences that were as well organized or as substantive. Ray Horton ran the program at that time, and I think the social enterprise content was basically a course on the municipal budget. That was about as close as we got. I left, so just very briefly, a word on background, and I think I'll end under 4 minutes, but not quite 5. I finished the business school. I went into chemical bank and middle market real estate. I had done work in not-for-profit, but didn't really understand too much about this industry. And when I arrived at chemical bank, there was this small group around the corner and behind the soda machine called the Community Development Group. That was Lewis Jones at that time. I'd never heard of these. I'd never heard of CRA, but I very quickly learned more about the group and became more interested in that. I tried to move into the group. When that didn't work, I quit and I went to work. I left Chemical Bank. I went to work at Chase until Chemical took over Chase, Manhattan Bank, and then I stayed a little bit longer, and I had the bright idea to leave and to go to J.P. Morgan. And about a half an hour later, Chase bought J.P. Morgan. I was sort of a leading economic indicator in a perverse way. And since then have worked, we left quickly, by the way, after that. And I worked subsequently at Merrill Lynch and HSBC, and I'm now at Goldman. So I've had an interesting run through the retail banking industry, the wholesale banks, and now obviously work at a bank holding company where we have a commercial bank, obviously, but are approaching community development in a quite an interesting way. As I speak, I hope to bring the lessons I've learned through that career, and in addition, my work at the National Housing Conference, where I'm on the board, and the Low Income Investment Fund, which is one of the most prominent and strongest CDFIs in the country. Just briefly, at UIG, which is the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs, our team provides direct project finance, primarily to real estate projects. We provide debt and equity and structured finance deals. mostly focusing on multifamily housing, but really addressing a wide range of both housing and community development needs and opportunities. We manage the bank's CRA program, and so we finance a wide range of projects, and we even happen to have a borrower or an investee here in the audience. We'll talk about that later. We focus on strategic partners. We're not a retail bank in the small r retail classic sense of the word. We work with just a few people, and we try to provide, a full range of solutions from either early stage equity or pre-development financing to construction or interim period equity and debt, and including permanent equity either through tax credit finance or other types of more classic equity. And we focus on high impact projects that have a real innovative bent to them. With that, I'll stop and pass the baton.
Wow, that was quick. Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to John and Lynn. Part of the questions that John put forward for the panel were a little bit about the history of public-private involvement in affordable housing community development. So maybe I'll just spend a few minutes talking about that, because I do think it's quite an interesting history, and I'll focus on the housing side of things because that's what I really know best. I work for the state 2 housing agencies which just recently merged. So we do all the 9% low-income housing tax credit financing for the state, as well as tax-exempt bond financing and a whole host of grant programs, most of which are funded through HUD, through the federal government. So the history of affordable housing, I think, is quite interesting in relation to the question of public-private involvement, because it started out really with public housing, which was bought, constructed, and managed strictly by the government. So there was no real public involvement other than actually being hired as contractors. So that quickly, that was the 40s and 50s, basically. In the 60s, the model turned to private developers with insured or subsidized mortgages, largely through HUD. So you did have now both private banking involved and private developer owners, but very heavily regulated. So the model in New York State in the 60s and 70s was largely the Mitchell-Lama program, which some of you may probably know or even live in a former Mitchell-Lama building. A lot of them have been converted. So that was low and moderate and even middle income housing, like I said, that was financed through government insured or government subsidized mortgages, but very heavily regulated actually by my agency or the city in terms of rents, in terms of any kind of capital work. You had to get approvals from agencies. So again, very strong hand of government. Again, sort of as the 70s and 80s turned to more of a privatization and distrust of the government, the real big switch was to the low-income housing tax credit program in 1986, which was part of the big tax reform in that year. And the tax credit program at the time was actually seen as a little bit of a throwaway because the Tax Act eliminated all the enhanced depreciation, which was how most of the multifamily rental housing was being built at that time. But the tax credits turned in the next 5 or 10 years to be the biggest producer of low-income housing. And its model is truly a public-private partnership. So the way it works is that the federal government allocates to the states a certain amount of these tax credits based on per capita, based solely on population. The states then run annual competitions for developers come in and apply, like Paul's entity would come in and apply to the state or the city for tax credits. And then when the tax credits are allocated to the winning entities, and it's quite competitive, like a 4-to-1 ratio in terms of applicants, then what the developers then do is sell the credits to investors. And in turn, because the credits are not what we call specially allocatable, the investors actually have to own the property. They have to to own the credits, they have to actually own the real estate. So it's a rather complex structure, but it brings in both very big institutions like Goldman Sachs or for a long time Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were the biggest buyers of these tax credits. Working with, in Paul's is a rather sophisticated group, but sometimes very small not-for-profit developers working with these big sophisticated financial institutions. So there's a lot more that obviously could be said about it, but that is the predominant model currently that we have for developing low-income housing in this country is this public-private partnership, and it's really a partnership that often involves multiple funding sources, you know, hard debt or soft debt, numerous subsidies, including these tax credits, and as I said, both what can be very small developers, often nonprofits, although increasingly for-profit, and these big financial institutions. So that's sort of a progression, a little bit of the progression of the role of government and in affordable housing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Hi, good morning. I actually brought along a handout because in order to explain Jonathan Rose Companies, I actually need help. So if everyone would look at the second page, which says planning, civic, cultural, and educational. I'll sort of start with that slide. So just to talk very briefly about the history of Jonathan Rose Companies. Jonathan Rose himself is a third-generation real estate developer. The Rose Associates is his family's business. And in 1988, Jonathan decided to start his own business. His desire to do so was actually driven by sort of three ideas. One was his passion for real estate. He had grown up in his family's business and felt very passionately about real estate development. He also was passionate at that point, this was 1988, in what would have been known then as environmentalism. And Jonathan had lived out west. He was very focused on sort of the environment, and he really wanted to understand how could real estate and the environment fit together. The final piece of all this is that Jonathan's family and Jonathan himself had been very involved in different philanthropic activities, and actually had played a very active role on the board of many not-for-profits. Jonathan himself in particular had been very active with settlement housing, one of the oldest sort of housing organizations in New York City on the Lower East Side, with its roots in sort of immigration in the late 19th century. And so Jonathan's idea in 1988 was how could he start a company that could pull together all these sort of aspects of his life into one company. From the very beginning, it was a company that was founded with a mission. It wasn't, the idea behind this mission was actually based on a Hebrew saying that I won't try to say, but the idea behind it is that our mission is to repair the fabric of communities while preserving the land around them. And from the very beginning, Jonathan was trying to do projects that today would seem familiar to us, but in the early 90s, it seemed like they were from Mars. So it's interesting. So for instance, in the early 90s, Jonathan partnered with the Grayston Foundation in Yonkers to do an AIDS residence. And one of the things that was discovered at that time was that people who've been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS have a very high susceptibility to indoor air quality, to off-gassing from chemicals. And so this building was done in a way that was very focused on how to maximize the indoor air quality and remove contaminants, and essentially was absolutely prescient in terms of sort of what later became the sort of standard lead ideas around indoor air quality. So, it's sort of interesting, fast forward today, it actually makes me think of my children who, essentially want to stamp their feet and they don't want to change, they want the whole world to change instead. And oddly enough, that's sort of what happened to us, that, Jonathan was saying this mantra, was proposing this idea for how development should happen, and lo and behold, there was a tidal shift in sort of the whole world in terms of sort of what was perceived as an idea of how green should be integrated into design and development, and we found ourselves in a position that that Jonathan had been advocating for 20 years at that point. It's interesting for me, I joined Jonathan about 5 years ago, and very shortly after I joined the company, we actually had a meeting with the whole company, and we said, we no longer have to start meetings by giving an explanation of what green design and green development are. People know it now. We can drop that out of sort of the preamble that we do to every meeting with a new client. And I often think about that. I feel like it was this really interesting moment where essentially we no longer had to be converters, we now were sort of implementers and sort of demonstrators of ideas. Okay. The other idea Jonathan has is that he does not want our company to be exclusively a real estate development company. He really has this idea of the total city, and he wants our company to act in all venues of the total city. And this is manifested in particular in sort of 4 practice groups that we have. And so if you look at this first slide, it shows our 4 practice groups. 2 of these are consulting based, they're on the top. One of them is our planning group. Our planning group, once again, all 4 groups are very organized and focused around this idea of this green mission. But our planning group in particular works often with cities, community groups, neighborhoods, institutions, around general planning, but often specifically around green ideas or green implementation. So for instance, one of the things our group did was worked with the state of Louisiana in order to define the green guidelines for rebuilding Louisiana after Katrina. We have a second group, which is our civic, cultural, and educational group, and that group provides essentially owner's rep consulting services to specifically civic, cultural, and educational organizations in order to help them carry out major real estate projects. Here in New York City, an example of a project we just finished was the new academic building with Cooper Union, which many of you might be familiar with. That group also has a real expertise in doing theaters. We've done half a dozen Broadway-style theaters, working with different theater groups. And we actually now are beginning to work very actively with different charter school groups. The fourth group on the lower right-hand corner is our investment group. And the investment fund targets in particular 2 different types of investment groups. One is what I think of as sort of Class B office buildings, usually sort of beautiful old office buildings built in the early 20th to mid 20th century, often ones that might be perceived as obsolete but actually have access to they're usually in great downtown locations, access to light and air. And the one shown in this particular slide is the Vance building in Seattle. It's a real success. We bought it, we renovated it in a very green renovation that dramatically reduced its energy consumption. We essentially rebranded it as a center for environmental not-for-profit groups, and it has in fact become the center for sort of those organizations within Seattle. And during this economic downturn has outperformed all the other sort of downtown buildings in terms of sort of rents and occupancy, I think, because of this distinction that it has. Our fourth group is our development group, which I am the head of the New York City Development Group. And if you want to switch to the next page, it's interesting, and in my definition of Jonathan Rose companies, I didn't say that we by definition must be doing affordable housing. By definition, we must be doing green development. But what we found is, the opposite of what we want to do is take out a cornfield and put up a building. And so the opposite of that actually is urban infill redevelopment in the center of our cities. And what we have found, and it accords with Jonathan's other social ideas, that often those projects, if in fact they include a component of affordable housing, are all going to go a lot better. And so we actually, as an organization, have become real specialists in doing affordable housing. And I'll just show 4 projects here. On the upper left-hand corner, the Fortune Society is a project we just finished in July. It's very close to here, actually. It's at West 140th Street. It's 114 units of affordable housing, half of it reserved for people who have come out of the criminal justice system, half of it is straight-ahead affordable housing. On the right top corner is our Metro Green project. It's right at the Stamford train station. It is 50 units of affordable housing, which were part of a whole transit-oriented development plan for the redevelopment around the station. In the lower left corner is 200 units on West 135th Street. This is a project that was acquired by our investments group with the intention of, it's 100% affordable, project-based Section 8. We bought it with the intention of preserving it in the long term as affordable housing. And then finally, in the lower right corner is our Tapestry project, which just opened last May. It is 185 units, mixed income rental, 50% market rate, 30% targeted at middle income, 20% straight ahead affordable. It's now achieved about 70% lease up. We'll hopefully have it fully leased up by the end of the year. And I think is an example of how I think a project that can integrate both affordable and market rate housing. So.
With those introductions, I think you've gotten a really good overview of the diversity, and also, I mean, if you listen between the lines of what people have said, this is a very complex field, and What I'd like to do is to ask each of the panelists different questions. Some ask them to answer the same question, but let me start with you, Dan. How do you define high-impact projects, and how do you think about the way you allocate the funds for investment to make a difference from a community development, perspective? And you can sort of explain how affordable housing fits in that, but that's a particular underwriting approach, high-impact projects.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of ways to answer that. I think, first of all, community development is a broad umbrella. It's a large circle, and I think affordable housing is really a circle within that. When I think about community development and high impact, I think we're thinking about outcomes, whereas when you're talking really just about the development of affordable housing, most people are just talking about units, maybe except for the Jonathan Rose Company. And so really when you're talking about projects of high impact, you're looking for sustainability, and you're looking for projects which will create revitalization and stabilization, somewhat overused terms, but it's really recognizing that you can help finance something, help create something that will create outcomes, that will not only provide places to live, but also jobs, education, supportive services, and sort of improved quality of life. So there are many examples. We're financing projects where, first of all, one level of impact is what we're bringing to the table. So one problem in community development is it's a very fragmented field. You need subsidy, you need equity, you need debt. And so one of the ways we create impact is by becoming a one-stop provider. And we can talk more about that, but that, I think, creates a huge benefit to developers of affordable housing and community development projects. I think the second thing is really having and as part and parcel of that, is having a toolkit. We're able to provide early stage financing, be it by grant, by pre-development loan, by early stage equity, that allows a developer to go out and assemble land, take the time to entitle that land, get improvements, get public approvals, things like that, and then we help the developers really in a partnership arrange those subsidies and move that project to fruition and then to some level of permanent financing. The high impact also will come from mixed uses, and I think we're seeing more of that integration of incomes, projects which contain both a charter school and other types of retail services, or residential units above and neighborhood serving retail below. So I think more people have a mindset around that. The other issue in affordable housing and community development finance is that it's been very siloed. People will, we will all work through production programs. Everybody's been focused on units. You had projects where people would just grab land and go get subsidy and build something there because they could, and they could raise the money for it, less so from a sense of kind of a coordinated planning approach. And so we look for projects that make sense, that are within the local context, that respond to what the local government or local community groups are asking for, and really, again, try to, create comprehensive solutions that are sustainable.
Where does the early stage equity come from? I mean, it seems to me a really important piece of what you're trying to do, because you can stimulate projects that otherwise might not get done, because that early stage equity is what keeps many community groups or for-profit developers from being able to move forward. It takes so much time.
Well, I'll take a quick shot, and then I'm sure others have an answer. I think, for-profit developers, there is some out-of-pocket, there's equity. They, of course, don't really know what that is or don't want to offer that up more typically. You won't find early-stage equity from most banks or from most financial institutions. A lot of that is obviously CRA motivated. We happen to sit in a shop that was created and has both the capital allocation and the management support to provide that kind of equity. Otherwise, really, I think the sources are more from CDFIs, who provide, pre-development lending. They raise their capital from banks. CDFIs have a mission orientation to provide that, and that's effectively it. Really, most of the equity in our industry comes out of tax credit financing programs, and you don't see that until the building is built, or at least under construction. Others?
Paul, you have something to add to that? I think Jonathan Rowe's company raises funds through a PE structure, private equity structure, so maybe you could address that.
Well, those funds, of which Goldman is an investor, are specifically for the acquisition of buildings. And I would say that in some respects, the equity that we're often putting into a project is actually our staff time. These projects take an extraordinarily long time to come to fruition. The example I give is the Fortune Society project, one of the projects I showed on my matrix. It was a home run. Everything about that project went perfectly. We hit every funding application in the first round. It was a very complex project, had enormous political support. But even with that, from the first sort of contact to the Fortune Society coming to us beginning to figure out how to do that project, until this last July when we finished construction, it's not even fully leased up yet, we're talking over 5 years. And Jonathan Rowe's company staff, worked hard on that project for 3 years before seeing a dime. So, there is essentially an extremely long investment of time and intelligence into a project before you actually begin to see, revenue coming out of it.
I would want to echo that. Many years ago, I was on the board of a LISC subsidiary called the Retail Initiative, and actually we were responsible for the 125th Street Pathmark supermarket, which was, Harlem had wanted a supermarket for 20 years. And this was, and it took us a lot of time to actually put that project in place. And that, the model that the Retail Initiative, or TRI, had in place was they had money from life insurance companies and public pension funds to stimulate retail in communities, because affordable housing wasn't enough to sort of provide the kind of fabric you needed to develop a community. And it was a well thought out, model of business strategy and financing. But one of the things that took us by total surprise was that we, TRI and the staff, had to do all the pre-development work, because the not-for-profit CDCs who had been doing housing did not have the same housing. Commercial development's totally different from housing. And they didn't have the skills to make that transition, so that TRI had to do all the kind of pre-development work that I think Paul is talking about, and that is equity. I mean, it's basically institutional sweat equity. And so for those of you who are in that arena of affordable housing, for example, and are thinking about broadening your agenda, you need to sort of think about how you do that with personnel as well. Arlo, let me ask a question. How do you feel that the financing of affordable housing has changed in the past? You gave us a great overview of the history. But what are the issues that private developers and not-for-profits face? Are they different in financing affordable housing today? Can you just give us some sense of the, you got non-for-profits, for-profit, and then you have other kind of service providers?
Well, I think in some ways affordable housing, and I'd welcome, my colleagues' input, in some ways affordable housing finance is pretty similar whether or not you're a for-profit or a nonprofit. As Dan said, all the equity pretty much comes from tax credits, if you're talking about low-income housing, that is. The one, I guess, variable is if you're doing a bond finance project, you have true hard debt, and you have a construction letter of credit provider, and you need a permanent credit enhancer, often Fannie or Freddie. And in the 9% tax credit deals, you just often don't have very much hard debt at all, and certainly it's some ways a less complex debt structure. But so I think the differences are, for the most part, the for-profits I think have achieved, especially like Jonathan Rowe's, have achieved a scale that many of the nonprofits have not been able to achieve. And there's some exceptions to that. Phipps Houses comes to mind as an exception. They own thousands and thousands of units. I mean, they've been around for over 100 years, but they are probably, they have a staff of 50 or 100 people and can put in the kind of sweat equity that Paul described. But most of the nonprofits they come out of the CDC movement of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and are in a staff of 10 to 20, maybe that's a big staff, in fact. And so if they do 1 or 2 projects a year, that's a lot. And it also has changed for those groups with the drying up of the city, in talking New York City in particular, the drying up of the city-owned land. So, from the whole abandonment that New York City saw in the 70s and 80s, the city was the biggest landlord, in fact, of the whole city. And so what it decided to do was turn over much of that land to not-for-profit CDCs for $1 and help them achieve the financing to do low-income housing. And it's been an incredible success overall in terms of strengthening these neighborhoods, Central Harlem, South Bronx, Central Brooklyn. But there was a whole CDC sort of cohort that grew up around that free land, which is now really struggling because that free land, the city is basically done with that land. So now the CDCs have to compete with groups like Jonathan Rose or Phipps for the privately owned land, and they really can't do it. So I know there's been some, LISC and Enterprise have been looking at what is the future of these CDCs? And frankly, not all of them are going to survive. So there needs to be some mergers, some branching out to charter school, to other sort of mission-based activities, because there's just not enough of the housing deals to go around. So I hope that answered your question.
It does. It also raises another question, as so often happens in these panels. Is there a simple way to describe, if we just do it in percentages, the affordable housing universe, how much of it is coming from, we'll take it in New York City because it would be impossible nationally, how much of it is coming from the for-profits, how much is coming from the not-for-profits? And has that changed? What you're saying is, suggests that there's likely been a growth in the for-profit providers, but what's the scale of that? How...
Right. I don't have the numbers. I don't have the numbers, but my sense is definitely that it would be more for-profit over the last 5 years. And Dan's nodding. So you have a couple of very, not very big, but big players in the New York City. Jonathan Rose being one, increasingly, L&M, a few others who really tend to, they do 3 or 4 or 5 projects a year. And the nonprofits, like I said, are it's a lot for them to do 1 project a year, most of them. So, we do, on our allocation, the state's allocation, I believe the cities as well, of the 9% credits, we do have a set aside, a certain amount of our credits have to be for not-for-profits. And in fact, that's federally mandated, but I think it's 10 or 20%. So, I would say it's definitely over 50% that's doing by for-profits.
That's a huge, huge change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you all add.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I feel like it's being set up a little bit sort of for-profits versus not-for-profits. And, our model is one that is actually shown by the projects that I've shown here, that we actually do almost all of our projects in partnership with a not-for-profit. And the idea there, as I mentioned, Jonathan had not-for-profit he continues to have not-for-profit board experience. I actually personally worked for Catholic Charities, Brooklyn and Queens, for over 10 years. So I came out of the not-for-profit sector as well. And I think, one of our strengths is that I think we do a nice job partnering with not-for-profits in order to come up with a real win-win situation. I think that, there can be a misperception that, sort of the for-profit developer sweeps in, somehow is, using the not-for-profit in a way and then, tossing them aside after they've gotten whatever benefit out of them. And I think that if, in fact, you can construct these partnerships well, it can really be a win-win for both. So, for instance, once again, to refer to the Fortune Society project, what they brought to the table, they owned the parcel. They had intense community support, and I've got to just tell a quick little story about that. This is a building They already are running a facility where people who've just come out of prison come and live for a period of time as they're transitioning back into society, and now they wanted to expand that mission with permanent housing for this same group of people. And when Fortune first approached me, even with my not-for-profit background, I thought, whoa, this is gonna be the most intense NIMBYism I will ever experience. And when I went to the first community board meeting, about this project with the Fortune Society, I was in the front of the room with my mouth hanging open, as just the support from the community was enormous. And Fortune had done a wonderful job of really showing that this is a population that, when given a chance, can turn around, can really be an asset to a community. And and I think the work that they had done to build this community support and their expertise in this type of project was very valuable and a real contribution to the project. We, meanwhile, brought all of our sort of development expertise. Fortune had only done one other real estate project previously, which maybe had not been a great success. So we actually, success from a real estate point of view. So we brought all our real estate expertise, our ability to manage consultants, our ability to sort of secure financing, provide guarantees, all this sort of real estate stuff, that made the project really happen. But without Fortune's contribution, it wouldn't have happened, in the same way that without our contribution, it wouldn't have happened. So I think that in the best case scenario, and I think New York really models this for the rest of the country, I think what you want to do is really create strategic partnerships between not-for-profits and for-profits in order to increase the capacity of what not-for-profits can achieve.
I would just add a couple of quick comments. I think it's worth taking a big step back for 1 second and just caveating a couple of things. One is, you're hearing a very New York-centric view. And affordable housing and community development in New York City is different than any other part in the country. We're of course different all the time, and we're real New Yorkers, but though we have a huge amount of challenge, we also have somewhat of an embarrassment of riches in terms of public and private sectors that are aligned, federal, state, and local government resources that are all targeted to the same kinds of outcomes. And in most other cities, it just ain't. They may donate land, they may have a zoning benefit, but they don't have a lot of the things that we do. So that's number one. I think number two is that rental is very different than home ownership, and I think we're also sort of leaning towards a discussion more around rental. Home ownership obviously is a huge topic of the day, and we're not talking about it because no one's doing it for obvious reasons, but we should spend a minute on that. Just to go back to the questions that were raised, I agree in general, and I think predominantly affordable housing has been developed and financed by the private sector. I think that's probably true for a couple of reasons. One is it's a capital-intensive business. There's a profit motivation. It takes equity to get some of this done. And housing, as much as it is a community resource, it's also a business and an asset, an investment that attracts private investors. Now, there's real issues around that. And that doesn't exclude at all the not-for-profit sector, because there are very large and very successful not-for-profits, but they are more mission-oriented, and the desired outcomes for them are simply different than somebody who's looking to just add more units and vertically integrate, to own housing, to construct housing, or to manage housing. That's really where I think some of the industry is going as well, because resources are harder to get, scale is important, and you can actually make a significant amount of money as a private developer of affordable housing. That said, and the last thing I'll add is that though there are differences, I think we also have to remember that in affordable housing, you're talking about what is, even though I've just said you can make money on some elements of the business, it is in some ways, relative to other businesses, uneconomic. You're basically talking about developing housing that is constrained on the rental or the revenue side, either by rent stabilization or by local government regulatory agreements, et cetera, but unconstrained, unfortunately, on the expense side. So that's why you need some of this capital intensity to develop these projects. And the second thing, there's just government regulation around it. So that simply means that for-profit developers and not-for-profit developers often face the same issues. A lack of equity, a fragmented system, in which to raise capital, access to risk capital, early stage to develop these projects. These are not, in some cases, hugely significant returns. These are more limited returns in this sector, again, relative to what you might do with that dollar. So not-for-profits and for-profits will often complain about all of the same issues. I'll stop there.
I'm just going to ask the panel one more question and then open it up to the floor. What do each of you see as the issues going ahead in the future, the issues that keep each of you awake at night if you're not exhausted from your jobs, the far-reaching things that you feel you have to think about?
Well, I think, Dan alluded to one, which is the future of the home ownership. First of all, I mean, our country has for 20 years, really, until the crisis, to paraphrase one, in fact, Treasury official gorged itself on housing and home ownership. And we're really, as New York City, again, totally different because of the low home ownership rate comparatively, is much different. But the rest of the country, especially in the Nevada, Florida, the sand states, dealing with a crushing hangover from that gorging. And that has, both short-term and I think long-term implications for how we view housing. And we've talked mostly about affordable housing, but the housing sector as a whole is relevant to affordable housing. And so one of the ways in which that manifests itself is the future of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So that is certainly, most people worry themselves about the future of the 30-year mortgage if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were to be privatized. But for those of us who live in rental-heavy places like New York City, they play a huge role in the multifamily affordable housing market, both on the debt and equity side. And if they were to go away, that would be a huge challenge for our sector. So that's one of the things that I think about.
I guess one of the things I'm very optimistic about is an increasing acceptance of urbanization and revitalization of our cities. The flip side of that is what is going to happen to our suburbs? What is going to happen to sort of less dense locations where there has been a significant capital investment? And it's interesting for me. I mean, we choose to do projects in dense urban areas, so we tend to benefit from what I think is a national trend. But I do sort of just wonder, as there's been a lot of writing about sort of the inner suburbs becoming, the new slums, the new places of decay, and it's interesting. It's interesting, and I think troubling to think about, will the ways that the cities were abandoned, in the 60s and 70s, will that now be repeated, but in more of a sort of decentralized model, which frankly might be harder to recover from?
That's the difference. You're talking to a developer who you have to be optimistic in this business, and you're talking to a banker when all they can talk about is how bad things are, because we're trained to think about risk. So this will be a good balance, and I'm always happy to talk to somebody who's optimistic. I would say a couple things from macro to micro. I think we shouldn't overreact to the moment, but I think it's obvious to say that the world is in an extremely difficult place right now, and the poverty statistics that have come out just last year from the census, talking about 2009, sort of illustrate that the world is, for low and moderate income people, and frankly even for working families, are increasingly challenged. That is just a headline issue. It is the macro issue, and we've got some real thinking to do around community development to make sure that we're really creating some solutions for people. So I try not to despair too much about that, but in terms of income inequality, I think which has a lot of ripple effects, I think we've got some major challenges ahead. Arlo referred to this as well. It's just remarkable. The housing finance system has just absolutely been upended from front to back, and I think, the back is obviously the GSEs, which have created a very strong secondary market for affordable housing, for rental housing, and obviously also for single family. It will be very difficult for that problem to be worked out. It'll take a long time. But frankly, there's really no secondary market for other forms of community development finance, and that's a real challenge. Some people might see that as an opportunity. It'll take a while for things to recalibrate, and again, not just the secondary market, but the primary market, because banks who are the primary financiers of housing, really, and we can talk separately about private equity and other sources, are really contracting and will be more challenged over time. You know, things will get worse before they get better. As Arlo said, I mean, you cannot have a conversation like this without thinking about foreclosures, and you know, it's not just what you read in the paper every day. It is wiping out all of the hard work that the folks like my colleagues here have done in communities. What's happening to our neighborhoods is really sort of devastating, and that is not just affecting units; it's affecting, people and their families and their income and their own personal economic viability. Those are challenging. That said, the trends for rental housing are very strong. The production's been down overall, and there are still will be some stronger drivers that will sustain rental housing. Rates will stay low for the next little while. That's a good thing, and that's probably one of the few things carrying the industry along. But through drivers like immigration and more minority households that are both renting and owning, there will be some strong supports for rental housing. I'll stop.
Yeah, I would add one other thing, and that's evident in the audience,
aggressive.
and as I see over the course of years. I started as a city planner, and I ended up in business school, and that combination brings to me many students, several of which my students are in this, former students are in the audience, people who want to do both, and that's different. That's different than the situation 15, 20 years ago. And I see optimism in the number of people who want careers in this interface between social enterprise and real estate and business and social enterprise. And so people make the difference still, and they make change happen. I'm a 60s child, and we believe that we could make change, and I still believe that's possible. So I would open it up to questions that you all have, and oh good, John has the, and you can direct your question to anyone in particular if that's the need.
So, well, first of all, I really want to say to Paul, I'm a big fan of what you guys do with the Fortune Society Project. My passion outside of real estate and music is is the reentry alternatives to incarceration. Big fan of the Fortune Society, Joanne Page and Glenn Martin, and I really think it's a great thing that you guys did for that project. My question is, two questions, one for Arlo and one for Dan. Arlo, what do you really think is the aggregate strategy for the federal government for tackling moderate income housing and not low income housing? You mentioned that low income housing, which for the audience is targeted at 60% or less of the area median, but there's this whole other range of affordable housing from 60 to 130 or wherever you classify it. That's really, I don't see a real strategy to tackle that piece of the segment. So what do you think is the federal government's aggregate strategy to tackle that? And then the second question for Dan is, to what degree is CRA sort of driving, or what degree will it drive sort of affordable housing construction in the future? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. There is, as I said, the low-income housing tax credit is by far the biggest production program that the federal government has and that all the states use, and that is, as you said, aimed at people at 60% area median. The other big program, which is on the demand side, as I call it, is the Section 8 voucher program, which is also for people mostly under 50% area median, the way it's technically under 80, but almost all of them go to very low income people because it's so oversubscribed. So I think the federal government doesn't have much of a program or philosophy in terms of rental. I mean, I think on home ownership, they would argue that the overall system of housing finance, the support for the GSEs, support for home ownership initiatives is tackle some segment of that middle to low to moderate income population, and I think that's true in some parts of the country. It's clearly not New York City, but in the problem is where the houses are affordable to those folks is generally either the declining suburbs or the really exurban places where your transportation costs and carbon emissions are extremely high. So, it's a great question. Sean Donovan, before he became HUD secretary, talked a lot about how he wanted to see the tax credit program change so that you would have to achieve your project would have to average 60% AMI, so you could go up to, 180, whatever, but, as long as you averaged. But, of course, HUD doesn't have control over this program. It's Congress's program, and from what I've heard from Charlie Rangel, who's the author of the tax credit program, he's not very interested in that idea. But who knows? But that is certainly one possibility, which I think would be certainly a good thing to look at. I mean, the lack of mixed income housing in most parts of, at least New York State. Jonathan Rose is an exception, and probably Dan has some projects, but for the most part, you're seeing either all market rate or all low income, and a lot of the places, New York City is an exception. It can, low income projects don't, create a drain or at least a perceived drain on a neighborhood. Like in upstate, all the mayors beg us for middle income, mixed income, market rate housing, because, they want to bring more income into their downtowns. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would just add that, New York's a high-cost market, and that's the biggest challenge, whether it's land or the cost of development or other types of things. So, there are programs which support low income, although the mayor's new program, which is not so new anymore, which proposed the development of 65,000 units, was much more oriented to middle and moderate income and much less oriented to low income, in fact. And so the use of tax-exempt bonds and other types of city subsidies now have programs in there which skew the allowable incomes as high as 250% of the area median income, which is 65,000 for a family of four, something like that. So the mayor's whole focus, I think, through his term has been to get to working families, two-income families, the classic sort of teacher and cop, et cetera, the nurse. So I think there are more of those. Your question, I think, touched on another interesting issue, which is that, who's driving the support for affordable housing? It really was the federal government years ago, and then the federal government sort of retracted, leaving only the low-income housing tax credit program. And the innovation and the funding really started to come more so from the state and from local governments. I think you're seeing a swing back as state and local governments will be under incredible budgetary pressure. That's going to be an enormous challenge. And you're seeing the federal government trying to figure out new solutions, whether it's FHA financing or other types of things. They'll never supplant it. We need all of those resources. And we need them to be focused on moderate as well as low income. Sorry to belabor that. CRA, we could spend 2 hours on it. I think it would be interesting to get the perspective from folks on the other side of the table. I guess what I would say is that CRA is a 35-year-old law that is way, way out of date. CRA is an extremely contentious issue where there have been attempts over time with failure to come together and create some reform. Because of the financial crisis, I think you're seeing some increased attention around CRA. There's been hearings on how the law should be changed, and a bill was just introduced this past week in the House, which would create some reform, but I think the prospects are very low. I think if you take a giant step back, and as business school students, you can all understand, we won't really succeed here, and we won't attract a lot of capital until we create, I think, what they used to call in marketing as a pull strategy, not a push strategy, if I have that right, which simply means you need to create, investment opportunities in community development finance to attract not just banks who are compelled to do so by CRA, but other investment sources. I think the other thing that's clear is that there are other non-bank financial institutions or companies which benefit from working in low-income communities which don't have the same obligations, insurance companies. And you can see, a withdrawal of insurance companies or other types of those who provide financial products from low-income communities, which create the same, negative consequences. So, look, I think CRA will be around forever. I think the attention on Capitol Hill will intensify because of what's been going on and the antipathy, frankly, towards banks. I'm hoping that there will be some positive reform, but I think it's going to be intractable. But the banking system has moved on, the way we collect deposits, the way we serve communities, and the law needs to be changed to reflect that.
I think we have time for one more question.
Just one more.
Hi, good morning. My name is Frank Lamore. I work for Queens Economic Development Corporation. We do neighborhood revitalization. We work mainly with disadvantaged communities. Back in the late 70s, our organization partnered up with private developers and different nonprofit organizations to build a shopping center in Hollis, Queens. I mean, there was nothing there. There was no access to food or a pharmacy or banking, and so the project took 10 years, right? And like our organization would say, if we could do it faster, the private sector would do it, not nonprofit. I guess my question is both to Paul and Dan. You spoke about those partnerships with nonprofit organizations. That's important, and things have changed from those times to now. And what are you asking, I guess, from nonprofits, or where do you see the possibility that nonprofits could now play a role, and maybe it's different from then and now, to really bring developers to the table and invest in communities that, frankly, do have funding. We do retail analysis and market analysis of incomes and demographic information of people that live in what should be low-income neighborhoods, but there's money that can be invested in those neighborhoods, and we have the facts to prove it. What does it take, or what role should more nonprofits play with developers in order to create projects for development?
I mean, not to oversimplify the issue, but I think that not-for-profits, I feel, CDCs in particular, their real expertise is based within their community, and their opportunity to, say, carry out a major real estate project is something that might happen, I don't think, even once a year, once every 2 or 3 years. And so I think, the issue there is they're just not going to develop, I think, the expertise in carrying out complex, mixed-use real estate projects, if that's their sort of pipeline. And I'm not criticizing that pipeline. I think that pipeline actually fits, that's appropriate for a community. It's an appropriate sort of pace for which a CDC to work. I think that, given that, the CDCs benefit in partnering with for-profit organizations, say like Jonathan Rose companies, who are closing 4 or 5 deals a year in different markets, I think can bring a perspective and expertise in order to make sure that the project happens in a very efficient way that satisfies the public and private investors in the project. So I think it's a question of, I think, each group bringing their particular, the not-for-profit and the for-profit group, each bringing their expertise in order to make the project happen. I'll say one more thing, which might be a little controversial, which is that I don't think that the relative unhealth of the CDC sector is exclusively sort of, where did that come from? My experience in terms of public financing of CDC projects is that, the public agencies are trying to build as many units as possible by putting in as little money as possible. And frankly, I think they often do that at the expense of the health of the not-for-profit. They ask the not-for-profit to pledge any developer fees back into the project. They, I think, push them to have unrealistic assumptions in terms of sort of how much it will really take to develop and operate that building. And then at the end of the day, when all of a sudden, this not-for-profit is in fact not being able to keep a project in the black, everyone's sort of surprised, how did that happen? And so I think that, partially, I think that where the public sector can play a role here is in recognizing what are the true costs of doing real estate, socially based real estate development projects, which have, I think, within them a certain inherent inefficiency, and to make sure that they are funded properly so that they don't undermine the health of the not-for-profit. And I think also to recognize that there is an inherent efficiency that comes from for-profit, not-for-profit partnerships, and to sort of accept that. I mean, I think that we often have to fight with public agencies for our portion of a developer fee on a project. This sort of idea of, why should the for-profit developer get their developer fee? But on the other hand, every project that we've done recently has come in ahead of schedule and actually has come in under budget with contingency left over that we've often been able to sort of then pledge as project reserves and really contribute to the long-term health of that project. And I think that that needs to be valued by the public sector as well.
I'll just add briefly, that's a fabulous answer, so I won't answer your question directly because I think that's a good one. I would just add quickly that having been around for 20 years and having actually worked on that Pathmark, which took 7 years, I think it's interesting to contrast where we've been in retail development to where we are today. If you think about some large-scale retail projects, you see retailers coming back into core urban markets, and I think that will be interesting to see how that's sustained, even though right now we're in a little bit of a lull in the retail market, but you do see more commercial development. One thing that's propelling that, maybe not in the broadest sense, but in terms of the projects you're thinking about, is the new markets tax credit. And we didn't address that at all. Again, it could be another topic, but it's a new tool. It's bringing equity into community development projects, separate and apart from housing, which is very exciting. And again, for Zev and others, not just retail, but community facilities and other types of charter schools and things like that. That should be something we should all be focusing on more.
Well, I can see that we could go on for a lot longer, but the next group is coming in, so I want to thank this terrific panel and your attention as well.